You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi, welcome to the Campus Podcast. I'm Miranda Prynne, Campus Editor, your host for today. These past couple of weeks, we've been exploring the theme of interdisciplinarity in the Academy. There are various interpretations of exactly what interdisciplinarity means, but in essence, it does what it says on the tin. It is work that draws on and moves between different disciplines. This doesn't sound so revolutionary until one considers that disciplines are like the foundation stones upon which academic study and education has been built. But since the world doesn't actually operate in such knowledge silos, there has for some time now been growing awareness of the need to apply multi-layered expertise and varied disciplinary perspectives to addressing real-world challenges. So, as we'll hear shortly, interdisciplinarity is inextricably linked with what some term wicked problems, the major global challenges of our time. So, climate change, sustainability, disease, inequality, essentially the issues that the UN Sustainable Development Goals set out to address. But if interdisciplinary thinking is key to our salvation from these problems, why is it not being practiced more widely across higher education? And what can be done to advance this way of thinking? Well, let's find out. My colleague Eliza Compton and I spoke to two prestigious academics who are strong advocates for interdisciplinarity. In our first interview, I speak to Gabriele, a professor at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the Australian National University, who was an early proponent of interdisciplinarity. Since publishing a book called Disciplining Interdisciplinarity back in 2013, she has worked to develop interdisciplinarity as its own distinct discipline within the Academy, and to develop a global network of interdisciplinarians as inaugural president of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. Gabriele provides a clear explainer of interdisciplinarity and its uses for anyone less familiar with it, and she outlines the distinct skill set associated with this work, which she collates under the title Integration and Implementation Sciences. Our second interview with my colleague Eliza features Kate Crawford, a leading scholar of artificial intelligence and its impacts. Kate is a research professor at USC Annenberg in Los Angeles. She is a senior principal researcher at MSR in New York, an honorary professor at the University of Sydney, and the inaugural visiting chair for AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Her award-winning book, Atlas of AI, was named one of the best books of 2021 by New Scientist and the Financial Times. And her 20-year research career also includes groundbreaking creative collaborations, of which we will hear more shortly. Kate currently leads the Knowing Machines project, a transatlantic research collaboration of scientists, artists, and legal scholars that investigate how AI systems are trained. Given the broad-ranging implications of AI, societal, environmental, cultural, economic, even political, Kate's work is built on interdisciplinarity. During this conversation, you will hear how interdisciplinary thinking is vital to make sense of this powerful new force, and thus is core to Kate's scholarship, from research and discovery through to public engagement. But before we learn more about Kate's work, let's hear from Gabriele. Hi Gabriele, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Miranda.
You have been banging the drum for interdisciplinarity for some time now. Your book, Disciplining Interdisciplinarity, was published in 2013, so slightly terrifyingly, 12 years ago. And you've continued to pursue this mission. But before we get into the details of your work, could you briefly explain Interdisciplinarity, what is it? And how does it vary from transdisciplinarity or systems thinking?
It's a really good question. There are a range of definitions around, but it's important to look at how these terms are used. The terms are used very sloppily by many people. They're used quite interchangeably. And there's a great analysis done in 2017 by Julie Thompson-Klein, which looked at the different ways that the terms inter and transdisciplinarity are used and found that there are 4 different ways in which transdisciplinarity is used and about 6 or so different ways in which interdisciplinarity is used. So I think it's important for us to concentrate on one of those uses, which is as a way of dealing with complex societal and environmental problems. If we look at it that way, then interdisciplinarity really stays within the academy and brings together different disciplines. Transdisciplinarity goes outside the academy and also, as well as bringing together different disciplines, also brings in the people who are affected by the problem that you're interested in and the people who are able to do something about the problem that you're interested in. Decision makers, business people, community groups, people who take action, if you like. So transdisciplinarity has a broader focus than interdisciplinarity. I think that's probably the simplest way to do it. One of the other ways that Julie looked at it was that transdisciplinarity looks for a unity of knowledge. This is a different way of using transdisciplinarity. And the parallel with interdisciplinarity is working at the boundary of 2 disciplines. So if you think of something like behavioral economics or biochemistry, these are really where 2 disciplines have combined to form a new way of looking at the world. So it's a simple question, but the answer to the question is actually not that simple.
No, quite. I have to say, that's the first time I think anyone has explained the difference between inter and transdisciplinarity in a way that I can fully understand it. By that definition, transdisciplinarity is essentially taking the concept that bit further. Reading around interdisciplinarity, and we receive a lot of advice pieces to campus on this issue and how to sort of deliver it well in the context of teaching or research. But is it a fair point that perhaps interdisciplinarity is just a very dressed up way of saying generalist or jack of all trades?
Well, it's a really good question. I don't see it that way. I see it as a skill set in and of itself, which for me is analogous to statistics. So statisticians are the people you go to if you are working on a quantitative problem. Interdisciplinarians, or as I prefer to call them, integration and implementation scientists, are people that you go to if you're working on a complex problem. And what integration and implementation scientists can help you do, or interdisciplinarians or transdisciplinarians, they can help you think about who needs to be at the table. How do you frame the problem in a way that brings multiple perspectives to bear? How do you integrate those perspectives? And how do you do something with what you found? So I think there is a role for generalists. Some people would prefer to be generalists. I think this is another one of those different ways in which inter and transdisciplinarity are used for different purposes. And I think one of the things that really muddies the water and why there's so much confusion around is because we've got all these different users and different skill sets. And as I say, I think it's useful to focus in on inter and transdisciplinarity in dealing with complex problems, because I think that's where a lot of the focus is. People are realizing that complex problems can't be dealt with by one discipline alone, that you need to bring multiple perspectives to the table.
Yes, and that way you are using it to actually answer the most pressing need. You mentioned there that you believe interdisciplinarity requires or is formed of a skill set all of its own. Now, this is something you argued in the book that I mentioned earlier, Disciplining Interdisciplinarity. And I know off the back of that, you set out to codify the knowledge and skills involved in interdisciplinary work, which were often, and arguably still are, quite poorly defined and recognised. Can you talk us through what those knowledge and skills are? You've touched on a few things there, but can we get into a few more specifics?
Sure. I think there are 3 broad domains. One is understanding the problem more comprehensively and also understanding more comprehensively what you can do about it. The second is working with the people who can make a difference and doing that effectively. And the third is working together more effectively. So under each of those, there's a particular set of skills. So if we go backwards, working together effectively, you need to be a good communicator, you need to be able to work in teams effectively, and you need to engage with stakeholders effectively. If we look at supporting decision makers, you need to understand decision-making processes. You need to understand how change happens and that it's really complex. And you need to understand how to get research implemented. And if we go back to the first piece, which is understanding problems and actions more comprehensively, you need to be able to understand how to think systemically to bring in systems thinking. You need to understand the importance of context. You need to understand how to deal with what we don't know, not just ignoring it. You need to understand diversity. You need to be able to understand how to work with diverse viewpoints, with diverse values, diverse interests, and you need to be able to integrate. So you can never bring everything together to form a more comprehensive picture, but you need to be able to bring as much as you can together and understand that there are always going to be some outliers.
Yeah, and a lot of those, of course, are skills that people are clamoring for, not just in higher education, but across the board in industry, those kind of collaborative communication skills, but also the ability to unpick complexity and see from various angles and the different things that need to feed into solving it. And it's like a very, very complex version of project management. And you have explained where systems thinking fits into it. Now, taking all of those skills, I know that when you really focused on this, decided to break it down and look at it from the perspective of being its own skill set, that led to the creation of a new discipline called Integration and Implementation Sciences. How did you go about developing I2S as a concept, and what did it achieve?
So for me, the starting point was when I did a really large project looking at whether or not we should prescribe heroin to dependent heroin users. And that was the first time that I had an opportunity to deal with a complex problem in the way that I thought it should be dealt with. So I was in a really fortunate position of having carte blanche to bring in everybody that I thought should be brought in, both discipline-wise and stakeholder-wise, and we really worked closely with the government. When that process ended, I thought about, we'd done it all by the seat of our pants. This was in the 1990s. There was not much information around, not much knowledge around about how to do this stuff. So we'd done it by the seat of our pants. And at the end of that, I thought, this isn't good enough. There must be stuff out there that we can draw on. And so I spent a year going to the various conferences. So I went to the World Congress on Systems Sciences, I went to Action Research conferences, and I went to interdisciplinary conferences, a whole range. And in each of those conferences, I found something that was really, really useful, but none of it was enough on its own. And I thought, what we really need to do is to bring all this stuff together. And that was where the concept of integration and implementation sciences was born. So I was deliberate about making it a discipline. I'm a fan of disciplines, I have to say. I think they're great repositories of knowledge. And it seemed to me it would be terrific if we could codify this knowledge in that way. The book that you've so kindly mentioned was the first iteration of putting these ideas forward and the first iteration of thinking about how they should be structured. After that, I was trying to think about how to bring people together. So 9 years ago, I started a blog, which is now a blog and repository, Integration and Implementation Insights. It's a community blog, so anybody's invited to contribute, as long as they're interested in writing about concepts, methods, processes, any kind of tool that's useful for dealing with complex problems. And because we want these ideas, they're not ephemeral ideas, they're actually really useful. It's a really useful methods toolkit. We started to catalogue it. And the ideas that I gave to you earlier about systems and context and unknowns were the ways that we used as the primary constructs for cataloguing the blog posts. and they worked. We've made a few changes over the years, but not very many. And it worked much better than the ideas that I'd set out in disciplining interdisciplinarity. So that's kind of been the progression of these ideas. I should say the systems thinkers would be horrified to be a subset of integration and implementation sciences. They see themselves as kind of the overarching umbrella. And I think that's kind of a healthy debate to be having. But I do, in case there are systems thinkers listening, I do need to give that kind of a shout out. But to answer your question, so integration and implementation sciences is really saying to people across this range of communities, the systems thinkers, interdisciplinarians, action researchers, transdisciplinarians, post-normal scientists, implementation scientists, and on and on. There are about 20 or so groups that are formed to deal with complex problems. It's trying to say to them, look, we've got a lot in common. If we work together, A, we would be conceptually much stronger, and B, we would be much more influential in getting this accepted in the academy and in society more generally.
And would the end game for you be ideally that this would be taught as a program within a university and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, the university that I'm at, and this has happened quite independently of me, decided that every student should have the capability to, starting this year, every undergraduate student, by the time they graduate, they should have the capability to use disciplinary knowledge in transdisciplinary problem solving. I then got involved. I thought, fantastic. I then got involved in doing that. And a version of I2S is the basis for the kind of curriculum that we're trying to put together. So while students don't get it in lumps, across different courses in their undergraduate degree, they get to understand about all these different components, about understanding problems more comprehensively, working in teams, working with decision makers and other stakeholders. And they get some theory as well as the practice. And it's putting those two together that's really important in each of the areas that I talked about, systems thinking, teamwork, and so on.
That's a massive step, isn't it, in the right direction? I can see one of the things that might have some academics concerned would be they'd say, oh, but it's hugely important that we focus on our disciplines because that's how we reach the level of expertise by having a very narrow focus on a specific problem or a specific topic area that we're going to really, really put all our time and effort into. But you're not suggesting that there's not a place for that. It's just that you need both. So what you describe happening at ANU sounds very healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I work with people on complex problems, I want to work with people who are disciplinary experts because they're bringing to the table codified knowledge around a particular area. And if you work with somebody who's really good at their discipline, it just makes your life so much simpler in terms of understanding a complex problem. So they absolutely are complementary. And just as not everybody's suited to be a mathematician, not everybody's suited to be an integration and implementation scientist or interdisciplinarian or whatever we're going to call this term.
Yeah, we live in a rich and diverse world, which is a very good thing. Off the back of that, why is it then so challenging to successfully and effectively advance interdisciplinary work in higher education? Because it is something a lot of people are keen on, but I also read a lot of frustration being expressed at how challenging it seems to be to make it happen.
I guess there are a number of reasons for that. One is that what we're doing is new and universities are quite conservative organisations. We haven't really proved our value yet. I think that, we're kind of riding the bicycle and building it at the same time, if to take that analogy. And I think when you're up against established disciplines who really know their stuff and you're still kind of faffing around trying to figure things out, you don't look quite as polished as they are. So I think we need to be clear about that. Curriculums are also already incredibly crowded. Every discipline wants to be able to teach more than it already can, and therefore making space for a whole new way of doing things and saying, we've got to fit this into the curriculum too. And to be absolutely blunt about it, it's a zero-sum game. So if you want to do interdisciplinarity better, it means there are some other things that you can't do. And so I think it's those kinds of tensions that are playing out within the academy. it's happened before in universities. Every new discipline that's come along has had to find its own space. And we just have to be, I think, fairly upfront about it. And we have to prove our value. And I think as we get more experience, it becomes easier to do that. And it's also why I think we need to band together, because I think we're stronger together than in kind of separate groups doing systems thinking and action research and interdisciplinarity. It's much better if we're saying, look, we've got a set of tools that we can and skills that we can offer to deal with complex problems.
I can see it's a new kid on the block, and that is always going to make it tricky when there are a finite number of hours in the day and every discipline is fighting for more time on the airwaves. You mentioned the fact that obviously one of the helpful things to do in this context is to bring everyone together. So that brings me on nicely to the fact you are the inaugural president of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. Can you tell me a bit about this organisation?
So we see ourselves as two things. One is we see ourselves as a professional organisation for inter and transdisciplinarians. That you'll have gathered from our conversation that I'm actually interested in a much broader picture, right? And so what we're also interested in is thinking about how to build a network of networks. And one of the tasks that we are planning to undertake is not now, because we're still trying to find our feet, but it's certainly high on my agenda, is this idea of bringing all these networks together. I ran a conference in 2013 where we did that, where we invited all the different groups to the table. It was hugely successful, and it kind of opened people's eyes to what others were doing, and was really very exciting. But people are kind of drawn back into their home communities. It's very difficult to maintain those kinds of links. And so I think what we need is this network of networks and a push to keep it alive and to foster the links and new ways of working together. So it's not just disciplines that are siloed, it's the people thinking about complex problems who are pretty siloed too, and getting out of those silos is not easy.
The other thing that strikes me is the complex problems that you refer to, whether that be relating to health or the environment or inequality. These are global issues. So we not only need to think about them across different disciplines, but also across different nations and different, national policies and ways of working. So I can see the global nature of this is also hugely important.
Yeah, and one of the things that we have an opportunity to do, and one of the things that the Global Alliance is really trying to make happen is to move forward together as a global community. So most disciplines have evolved in the global north and then been exported into the global south. Thinking about complex problems has been happening in the global south just as much as it has been in the global north. They're not as well equipped because of funding issues to promote what they do, to make it public, to make it available. But I think certainly it's a huge job for the Global Alliance to be truly global, to really think about how can we foster the work that's already happening in the global south, and how can we foster learning from each other. We've got just as much to learn in the global north from the global south as vice versa. And so for me, the real joy of this work is that it gives us an opportunity to do something as a global community, and not, as I've said earlier, exporting from the global north to the global south.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and one that could be easily overlooked as one of the major benefits of taking this approach. Finally, on a more practical level, for anyone listening, what approaches can help researchers and educators break out of disciplinary silos?
It kind of depends on what you want to do, right? So a lot of people are happy in their disciplines. Good on them. A lot of disciplines are finding that the interesting questions are at the border between their discipline and some other discipline. So biology, for example, is getting huge strides from bringing physics into play. So that's a way that people start moving out. And then there are people, of which I'd class myself as one, who are really kind of keen to work across the disciplines. So it's about, I guess, showing people that there are options and making it possible for people who who want to work more broadly across a number of disciplines and maybe with stakeholders outside universities to make it possible for them to do it. I have to say, I've been incredibly fortunate at my university that the work that I've done has been supported all the way through my career. It hasn't been supported by everybody. I've certainly had heads of department who haven't supported it, but I've also then had people who are higher than them who have supported it. So I've kind of been cushioned, if you like. And I think that's one of the things we have to do. We have to provide a community for each other. And that's also one of the things that the Global Alliance is trying to do, is to give people a home so that they can find others who do this work and find support systems when their universities aren't maybe as supportive as they might be. But I think people are realising that this is the way of the future and are becoming more and more supportive of this kind of work.
Yeah. So I guess it's being led by the problems that you want to address, really, which is what you said from the start, that the simplest way to define this is to focus on these very complex problems which we desperately need addressed, but also then being open to conversations with people that you might not normally work with.
And, I've done a number of projects with people across a range of disciplines, and I get two I've cold called people to say, I'm doing this project. So, for example, I was doing one bringing different disciplines together to think about the unknown, because every discipline deals with the unknown differently. And I'd cold call people because I wanted a musician or I wanted somebody in sociology. And I'd get two kinds of responses. I'd get people who were like, you want to do what? And other people who were like, that sounds so exciting. Yes, please, sign me up. And you don't want everybody to do this because diversity is really important, right? But you do want to make it possible for the people who get excited about this to be able to do it.
Yes, that's a very good message to end on. Thank you so much for talking today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Gabriele provides a really solid overview there of interdisciplinarity, what it is, and why it is so important. In a brief chat we had after the recording, she told me that for much of the 25 years or so that she has worked on this, it very much felt like an uphill battle. But that has shifted in the last maybe 5 years, and for the first time in her career, she feels the wind is behind her sails. So that bodes well for the cause. If anyone still needs persuasion with a strong working example of why this cross-disciplinary work is so important, our next interview should do the trick. Given how much AI stands to transform all our lives, our planet, our ways of living, working, and even thinking, the need to understand it grows ever greater, and that cannot be done through a narrow lens. So, let's hear from Kate Crawford.
Kate Crawford is an award-winning author, researcher, policy advisor, and one of the world's leading scholars of the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. Her rigorously researched book, Atlas of AI, tracks the very tangible costs of artificial intelligence from human labour to mineral extraction, water and energy use, and the impact on privacy and power structures. In 2021, she worked with Vlad and Jola to produce the exhibition Calculating Empires, a genealogy of the technology and power since 1500, which won the grand prize of the European Commission for Art and Technology. She's talking to me right after the AI Action Summit in Paris, and I'm so grateful for her time today. Kate, welcome to the Campus Podcast.
Thank you so much, Eliza. It's a pleasure to be here.
The introductory text for Calculating Empires says, our technological systems are increasingly complex, interconnected, automated and opaque. And then a bit further down it goes on, the contemporary tendency towards simplification and solutionism has weakened the ability to handle dense information, while our technical and environmental realities only become more complex and interdependent. For those who haven't seen it, the work is an illustrated timeline of technical and social innovations over 5 centuries. And it really shows how the themes of communication, computation, classification and control are interwoven through time. So my first question for you, Kate, digs into this idea a bit, which is, why do global issues today require an interdisciplinary approach?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the genesis of this project goes all the way back to the start of 2020, during the beginning of the COVID lockdown. And Vladan and I were both, trapped in our homes on other sides of the planet. And we had previously collaborated together on a project called Anatomy of an AI System, which looked at the full planetary impacts of a single Amazon Echo, which is that little small device that you might have in your living room that you can ask questions to. We did a full sort of environmental and political and economic mapping of, what are the large-scale global systems that are required to make a system like that work. But we'd always wanted to put AI in a deeper historical context. So essentially, we moved from a project about space and AI to a project about time. So we did this at the beginning, really, of the generative AI turn, which, of course, as a professor who's been studying AI for almost 20 years, was very front of mind for me. But it was very clear that in all of the focus on generative AI, we were very much focused on the present moment, the latest AI model, the latest technique that you could use, without looking at the deeper history. And so from that concern really was born the project Calculating Empires, where we used many, many techniques, obviously primarily grounded in history of technology, history of science, STS, political economy, but also a range of techniques from the visual arts, from research analysis through visualization, to do effectively this enormous installation project. It's about 24 meters long, 3 meters high, and it gives you this sort of immersive environment that you can walk into and start to see the ways in which technology and power have been intertwined for 5 centuries. And I think for me, certainly, while I've written many papers over the years about the sort of historical context of the technologies we use, there's something about sort of collaborating in spaces that move into a visual art mode that allow people to receive this information differently, to be inside a space where you can have conversations, be it with, school groups or with, retirees or with people who come purely from the art world and the culture side rather than coming from academia. So for me, I think these issues around technology, power, and democracy are so important. It is a mistake to just assume that by writing a journal article, we're actually contributing to a wider public debate. It has been important to me, certainly for the last decade, to find not just interdisciplinary methods, but wider means of publication and sharing to really make this a public debate that more people can participate in.
Yeah, absolutely. That way of connecting with a broader audience is really evident in your body of work. You have just published a new paper with Sasha Lucioni of Hugging Face in Canada and Emma Struble at Carnegie Mellon, which looks at the Jevons paradox as it applies to AI, whereby efficiency gains, and I have just learnt this, whereby efficiency gains may paradoxically spur increased consumption, and that understanding this second order of impacts of AI really requires this interdisciplinary approach. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about those layers of impact.
Well, I mean, it's very timely at the moment, of course, with the release of DeepSeek R1, which is a large-scale AI model that was produced in many ways with far less cost, fewer compute cycles, and apparently 18 times less energy consumption, which is really quite startling. And particularly given if you've spent some time using DeepSeek's model, it's as good as, if not better than, state of the art. So many people were very excited about the release of DeepSeek because it pointed towards potentially more sustainable environmental systems for AI. Now, I've been studying the environmental impact of AI for the last 8 years, really since my eyes were opened by going to visit mines and going inside data centers and seeing just the enormous amounts of energy, minerals, and water needed to make these systems function. But it was looking at DeepSeek initially with excitement. Okay, this is a step forward in making AI models more efficient. that I started to realize that we have a deeper problem. And that problem is best encapsulated in what's known as Jevons paradox, this idea that, again, William Stanley Jevons really isolated this in the mid-1800s when he was studying coal consumption, and discovered that as coal engines were becoming more efficient in terms of how much coal was required, in fact, more people were using them. So any sort of savings that were being made in terms of making these engines more efficient was still resulting in more coal being required and being mined. And we're seeing something similar with AI, which is, even though there's this pathway now towards more efficient models, if we see, as in the case of DeepSeek, over 16 million people downloading the app and using the system in its opening weeks, that's a lot of energy that's being required in Chinese data centers. So what we're seeing is, unfortunately, with the ever-widening spread of AI, that even with more efficient models, this is not going to reduce the climate footprint. So what we argue in this paper is that we have to move beyond a very narrow technical efficiency perspective. Now, obviously, this paper is really asking for a more interdisciplinary framing, that we need to look at the way in which AI is not just being produced within its sort of technical silo, but what happens when it's actually proliferating into society, when millions, if not billions of people are using them. What kinds of behavioral effects and second order effects can we see? And this is actually quite fascinating, because you see, for example, substitution effects. If you used to use, say, Google search to find information online, and now you've started to use ChatGPT, what very few people realize is that that's somewhere between 10 to 15 times more energy intensive for every query. And of course, we also know that some systems, like, for example, Google's new AI answers, are being generated for you even if you don't ask for them. So it's like this almost sort of compulsory artificial intelligence. This comes with an enormous energy cost. So certainly part of what this paper is really trying to do is to look more widely at not just the models themselves and their costs of training, but what happens when they're actually being used very widely. What happens then to the energy and water needed to actually keep them going at scale? And of course, what happens at the end of life when so much of this hardware and infrastructure is thrown away in giant e-waste tips in places like Ghana and Pakistan, which right now, of course, e-waste is the single largest growing form of waste on the planet. So we have at the moment a very unsustainable form of AI that is in the ascendance.
Do you think that people really understand how the tentacles of effect really branch out? I mean, AI is often thought of as something that's intangible, but in fact it's not at all, as you're saying.
Well, I think it's very difficult for people to understand that, because they're so frequently exposed to marketing that says precisely the opposite. When you're presented with stories of AI as magical and otherworldly and immaterial and abstract, it's just so much code in the cloud, which is itself such a dematerializing metaphor. Of course, people assume that, this is in many ways almost a green technology, that it doesn't have this material footprint. So much of my work over the last decade has been really materializing AI, sort of bringing AI down to earth, if you will. And that has meant, in my case, spending time doing the field work of going to the places where artificial intelligence is made, visiting lithium mines. For example, last year I met with many of the activists who are protesting the rapid lithium extraction that's happening in the Atacama Desert in Chile, or going inside the data centers to see just how much drinking water is being used to cool the heat-producing GPUs, particularly in AI hyperscale data centers. And also looking at the human costs, going inside Amazon fulfillment factories to see, what is happening to the workers who are almost the last mile of automation, the people who are like putting your things inside packages and sending them out into the world, and the sort of the extreme physical stress of those jobs, and why they're under such extreme pressure to meet what's known as the rate, the rate at which they're supposed to be packaging maximal numbers of objects per hour. These are extremely stressful environments. So for me, looking at these costs, both to humans and to the planet, has for me been such an eye-opening journey as a researcher to really understand that what we're building with contemporary artificial intelligence is one of the most resource-intensive planetary systems that we've created as a species.
Yeah, reading Atlas really gave me pause. It's a fascinating read, but also deeply sobering. And I think in it you talk about the nature of artificial intelligence as being neither artificial nor intelligent, so very much grounded in the physical human world. And I think in another talk you said it was both technical and social, which I thought was interesting, and a constellation of different techniques. So I'm interested in what you think about the nature of assessing intelligence and creating knowledge, and what kind of interlocking elements are perhaps missing from machine learning. I was interested in the case study of clever hands in the introduction of the book and what that told us about the nature of intelligence.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I love the story of Clever Hans because it's, it was such an extraordinary cultural phenomenon. This was at the turn of the 20th century. Clever Hans was a horse who became a extraordinary international celebrity. He was, written about in the New York Times as being, this wonderful German horse that could do almost anything but talk, because he could effectively be asked questions like, what is 2 + 3, and then tap out the number 5 with his hoof. And so this was seen as, a horse that could do math, that could, respond to spelling words, all kinds of, complex questions and multiplications. And of course, what happened was that in addition to this animal being hailed as this extraordinary animal intelligence, it was found that in fact, poor old Clever Hans was really just responding to nonverbal signals from his trainer, von Osten. So von Osten was, in many cases, just almost imperceptibly, tensing when the right answer was coming near, when Hans is tapping something out with a hoof. And so, in fact, it was a much more complex story about how we recognize intelligence, how intelligence is produced, how it's commercialized, and how it's lionized, and then actually what's going on in the background. And I think that makes the story of Clever Hans really compelling, from multiple angles. I mean, of course, it's about the politics of intelligence and really what we come to understand as being a system that is displaying intelligent behavior. But interestingly, even in computer science, there's now something called the Clever Hans effect, which is also called the observer expectancy effect, which basically describes what happens when experimenters are unintentionally giving cues to their subjects, or in the case of computer science, when you've effectively over-engineered a system so that you will always get the answers that you are already expecting. So this is sometimes, in the technical field described as overfitting, but it's a consistent problem that we see in machine learning systems. So I think for me, stories like this remind us to be skeptical, to ask questions around how forms of knowledge are being made. And right now, of course, we're seeing AI be presented as, the apex of forms of intelligence, perhaps more intelligent than human beings. And, this for me, I think, evokes all sorts of troubling histories in the use of the term intelligence, eugenics just being one of them, slavery being another. The term itself has done many kinds of inordinate harm when it's seen as something, innate and unquestionable, rather than being socially and technically constructed.
Yeah, interesting. Well, given that intelligence is a multifaceted thing and a construct, what advice can you offer researchers about the sorts of skills needed for effective interdisciplinary research?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, we've never needed interdisciplinary research more in AI. And unfortunately, in so many ways, we're seeing the field go in the wrong direction. Of course, if we go back in the history of computer science, say in the 1980s and the 1990s, so much of what was happening in CS Labs was really at an experimental level. It was being, tested on sort of small groups, perhaps, creating forms of software that could do things like word processing. But this kind of new era of AI where large scale models are being produced and then live tested on millions of people. This is really very new, which means that you really need people in the room thinking about the social, the economic, the political impacts of these systems from the very outset. But unfortunately, you've seen a real narrowing in the field. In fact, a real sort of prioritization of so-called technical knowledge over all else, without, of course, recognizing that, even technical knowledge is itself socio-technical. It sort of brings particular assumptions with it and particular ways of seeing, which I sort of address in Atlas of AI. But if we go back to the very birth of artificial intelligence, sort of in the late 50s and early 60s, it was in many ways an interdiscipline. You had people like Margaret Mead coming in from anthropology, who was, having discussions with John Searle, and you had these very extraordinary moments of people saying this is in a way a system of thinking and seeing that requires maximal interdisciplinarity. And we're just not seeing that, particularly in the leading technical labs of AI around the world. They are really dominated, not just by computer scientists and engineers, but computer scientists and engineers from very similar places around the world and very similar universities. So you're seeing almost a type of hegemony of particular types of training and ways of producing. And I think that's very dangerous, particularly given that these systems affect people from very different parts of the world, different backgrounds, and different sectors, assuming that somehow, people have shared sets of ways of seeing and thinking and shared desires in the world. So, I think that the big problem we face is that we urgently need AI to be re-understood as interdisciplinary from the outset.
Yeah, so this sounds like it needs very, very human skills to perhaps counteract the technical skills. Is there anything that has served you well in your research that has helped you maybe get into areas that have been surprising or taken you down roads that you didn't expect to go?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess I've been doing this sort of work for a long time, long before AI was cool, shall we say. And, if I think about the way that I was really studying, large scale algorithmic systems, in the beginning, it was really sort of studying the algorithms, studying how they worked from a technical perspective, while sitting behind a desk. And the real shift for me came around 2016, 2017, when I started asking questions outside of the sort of technical pipelines of production to really draw on, more humanistic and social scientific ways of asking questions around what would happen when these systems were built. Who was benefiting, who was bearing the potential risks and harms, to going again to the sort of the places of construction, to have a sort of almost like a ethnographic approach to understanding these systems in context. That to me was the absolute game changer, and part of it really came from collaborations with people from very different backgrounds. That has, to me, been perhaps the most important step. I think one of the great things about collaborations with people in different disciplines and different fields is that you have to let go of the fact that you're the person who knows the most in the room. There will be absolutely areas that you are unfamiliar with that you need to listen and learn and be very humble about. And it's really marked me. I really love doing collaborations, but particularly with collaborations with people in fields I've never worked in. For example, I currently lead a research team called Knowing Machines, obviously about how machines are seen as a sort of epistemic form of knowing, but also how we might come to know machines and how they're being trained. And in forming this group, one of the things that was really important to me was not just thinking about, how do we include people from the social sciences as well as from computer science, but also how do we include investigative journalists? How do we include artists? How do we include people from very different backgrounds? across different fields and even outside of traditional academic fields. That has been transformative for me. And certainly projects like Calculating Empires, which is at once a history of science project, also a visual art piece, also a sort of a design intervention. That wouldn't really be possible if it was just me working by myself. It's in collaboration with people like Lana Njola, but also our whole team who became part of those discussions and meeting with professors around the world who have specializations in, say, the 1600s or in, shipbuilding in Venice in the 1500s. It's by sitting and listening and learning across those disciplinary lines that I think has been most powerful for me.
Well, it certainly produced a very powerful piece of work. To loop into the idea of collaboration, and for a final question before we run out of time, you are just back from the AI Action Summit in Paris, and you tweeted on the 11th of February that the summit had ended in a rupture between the accelerationists and the public interest camps. I wanted to know what your main takeaways from the event were, and where do you think the weighting lies between these two poles going forward?
Well, of course, it was a very intense week in Paris. It is following on from two prior AI summits. One was in the UK and one was in Korea. And for those prior events, the focus really had been on AI risks and how to build in guardrails, what's called AI safety. And that meant that nation states were gathering around to have difficult conversations about how to protect populations against the downside risks of these systems, which are very real. That would mean that, world leaders had to have a position on governance. How would they govern these systems in the public interest rather than purely in the interests of the corporate sector? This was, of course, why we've seen the creation of multiple institutes around AI safety. We've seen new forms of regulation, including the EU AI Act. And of course, in the US, it resulted in an executive order from President Biden addressing issues around AI risk and safety. Of course, now we're in a situation where in the US, we've seen President Trump, in fact, remove all of those protections, also remove the US from the Paris Agreement, a real collapse of those sorts of concerns and all of the work that had been done in those years. And unfortunately, at the Paris Summit, we saw some of this shift as well. What we saw, instead of a conversation that was centered on questions around risk and better governance, it was really around maximizing investment and what I call a type of AI accelerationism, which is like, how do we quickly make these systems bigger, better, scaled up, and very much to the benefit of the private sector, without sort of a vision of how this was going to support sustainability, labor, how we would think about public infrastructure and public oversight. So in that sense, we saw this extraordinary gulf emerging between those who care about these public interest questions and those who are really just very oriented around how do we kind of just speed up AI as much as possible. And so I think there are some real risks there. My concern is that having done this 4-year project around the history of empire and how empires have used technology to centralize power, that we're now seeing AI in its empire era, where we're seeing, honestly, the most concentrated industry on the planet be given, in the case of the United States, $500 billion. In the case of France, 109 billion euro to, again, private sector interests. So I think this is an extraordinary problem that is now posed to us, that we're seeing the real risks of these systems offset back onto civil society, while the benefits are really accruing to the few at the top of the industrial chain. So I think we have a real concern that has emerged, which is a question of where will the governance agenda go now if we're seeing governments simply reject their responsibilities in that department.
Yeah, well, we're certainly living in changeable and incredibly fast-moving times. It feels like more than ever we need voices from across the academic spectrum, across the political spectrum, being given space to be heard and contribute to the conversation. Kate, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm very grateful for your time and while you are jet lagged coming back from Paris. So thank you very much for sharing your insight with the Campus Podcast listeners.
It's really wonderful to talk with you, Eliza. And yes, here's hoping we can see some change, both from people working together in academia, but also more widely in the public.
If only Kate were running the show, I might feel less trepidation about the policy decisions relating to AI. But it is some comfort to know that scholars like herself are working hard to uncover and draw attention to the many knock-on effects of accelerating AI use. There were some really striking statements in that interview. That contemporary AI is one of the most resource-intensive planetary systems that we have created as a species. That to me just points to the need for much, much greater consideration in how these tools are presented, understood and used. Also, her point that intelligence is socially and culturally constructed is a very interesting one to ponder. One thing that I notice in talking to academics generally, about particularly those who like to work across different disciplines or collaborate with experts in different fields, they have to become very comfortable with the feeling of not knowing, with working beyond the boundaries of their knowledge. And that is something we all could benefit from getting a little better at. So it bodes well if interdisciplinary thinking is going to become more embedded into curricula and teaching in years to come. You can find much more advice on practicing interdisciplinarity on campus, including our most recent Spotlight Guide, which draws together loads of insight on interdisciplinary teaching. Go to www.timeshighereducation.com/campus to learn more. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and I'll be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.